What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the MLB Refresher Show. It doesn't really have a name. It doesn't need one. It just matters that we're here and you're here and we're talking baseball 2 days away to the start. Not the resumption, not like NBA, but the start of the MLB season. I'm Dave Loughran. With me, Adam Scherer, back in business, and Alex Baker, #1 ranked DFS player in the world. I always got to throw that out there. Why not, right? I'd want someone to do it if it was me. Anyway, we're happy to have you guys with us. Before we get started with anything here, if you missed yesterday's show afterwards, you go check that out. We broke down a lot of what the fantasy landscape is going to look like with this 60-game season and a whole lot more. Certain players and teams, some Vegas odds, all of that. Josh Engelman, Jake Hari, and myself. And then, if you're getting ready for basketball, myself, Adam, and Greg Ehrenberg last night gave you a little primer for the NBA restart. So this will all get you started. We'll have another MLB show tomorrow leading up to Thursday's 2-game slate, and we'll break down the slate. We'll get into some fantasy cruncher stuff tomorrow. But today, Alex, I think it's a good time to talk about projections and ownership and tools like the Top Stack tool and how they can be used to make you a better player as we get ready for the beginning of the season.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to it. I mean, everyone has their own approach to these different DFS sports, and MLB is probably one of the most strategic because you're balancing all these different factors like projections and ownership, and on a given day, any batter, like even Jeff Mathis, could put up a game-breaking score. So I think that there's some really interesting strategy that goes into making a DFS lineup.
Adam, when you use projections, a lot of people will. There's an argument to be made. It's not even an argument, but just facts that when you're looking at MMEing or you're playing 100, 150 lineups, or you're playing 3, or you're playing single entries. A lot of people think, there's no point in using projections for a 3-entry contest or a single entry contest. Do you still use, let's say you're doing a single entry, and we'll jump around a little bit here, or you're doing a 3 max. Will you use projections? Will you use ownership and then crunch it and then sort to take the top lineup or the top 3 lineups?
Yeah, I do basically more or less the exact same process when I'm playing single entry or 3 max as I do for large field tournaments. I might weight things a little bit differently because you're dealing typically with smaller fields in the 3 max and single entry. But the whole, you mentioned people not wanting to use projections or whatever for single entry and 3 max. That's never really made sense to me because, I'm not saying that you're just taking your top projected lineup because you're not, but projections are still just a way to quantify everything. So the alternative is that you're like building your lineup by hand, which is still basically you're just using like mental projections that aren't going to be, you're more likely to make mistakes that way than you are by using numbers. So I'd rather, and I prefer to still take my projections, run a bunch of lineups with them in Fantasy Cruncher, go through the lineups and kind of see what looks the best to me in terms of ownership projections and medium projections and all of that in order to decide what my top lineups are.
So I'll step back just for a second, Alex, and start at the ground floor here. Not everybody does use projections. And I can assure you of this. The purpose of today's show is not to be a sales pitch, but it's to give you an idea of what makes people better players. Alex and Adam are both very successful DFS players. So the best way to get an idea of how to become better is to listen to somebody else's strategy, somebody else's approach. So what is... I guess this is a question that could be tackled on several fronts, Alex, but what, as far as projections go, is the main purpose of having projections? For someone that says, I don't need projections, I can do it on my own.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends what tournament you're playing in. So if you're playing in cash games, just putting in like a good set of projections and building your optimal lineup can be a half-decent strategy. And I know a lot of people out there, like everyone has different purposes for playing DFS. Some guys want a little gamble, and that's a really easy way to get it. But if you want to win money over the long run, then you got to obviously come up with a more strategic approach to the game. And the way I think of it is you have to know the rules before you break them. And the problem with having a bad set of projections is that if you're trying to make all these decisions, trying to balance ownership and projections, a lot of times the ownership is concentrated around the best projected plays, and it will just kind of highlight any mistakes you have. So like if there's like an error and you have a guy too high, then if you're accounting for ownership too, you're going to end up with them in all your lineups. So it's really important to have accuracy. And, that's a big focus of mine because I'm entering so many tournaments.
And you'll hear some people say, I'm using projections that according to everybody else are the best projections, but I still can't win. And I do think there's a serious distinction there too between like having and using the best projections, but actually knowing how to use the best projections and apply them to your game.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, everyone comes into DFS thinking that if they build the lineup with the strongest players in it, they're going to be able to beat everyone else. And the problem is that worked about 5 years ago. The game has really progressed since then. And there's really good sources of predictions out there, even for free, like sports books. I mean, when they take money on a line, they're pretty much telling you who the market thinks are the best teams of the given day, and everyone knows that. So it's really easy to say like the Red Sox are going to be the highest projected team on a slate if their team total is like 6, but everyone knows that. So you really have to come up with something that goes a step further to be able to win at tournaments today.
Yeah, and similar question to you, Adam. Like when you take projections and apply them to your approach, to your strategy, what is your general process? You have them. A lot of people have them in front of them. They just don't know what to do once they have the actual information, the actual data. They say, okay, I have the best projections. And like Alex said, oftentimes what you'll see is they'll just be like, okay, well, he's projected the highest. He's projected the highest. Oh, I can fit all of these guys into my lineup. It's a done deal. This should be a winning lineup, at least over the long term. And a lot of times it isn't.
Right. And I think that's kind of why it's a balancing act, like Alex said, of everything that you're doing. And I think that my process in general does vary by sport, kind of accounting for what sports are more volatile than others. So like I'm going to be more creative in baseball, or be willing to be more creative in baseball than I am in basketball, for example, just because there's more variance in the projections. But I think that one mistake people still make, even though they have access to better projections, is kind of viewing medium projections as like where the player is actually going to end up at, as opposed to a medium projection and considering the full range of outcomes. And that's where, getting a little bit of ahead of where we'll talk about, but like the top stack tool that Alex puts out is something I use a lot, because it kind of helps me to quantify the range of outcomes for teams where even if, let's say the Red Sox are kind of a middle of the pack medium projection, they still have so many power hitters in their lineup that in a lot of cases their range of outcomes is still going to be really wide, and you're still going to get a lot of upside by going there, potentially at low ownership, since their medium projections are a little bit lower. So I think it's kind of a balancing act, trying to account for the range of outcomes, still make sure that your lineups project relatively well in terms of medium projections, and then that you have at least 1 or 2 solid pivots in there from an ownership standpoint, so that you're not just trying to basically outrun 30% of the field at the top.
And so often you see people, they'll tweet something out, usually newer players. They're like, man, you had this guy projected at 48 and he finished with 60. These projections are horrible. Where they expect, you've seen it. You and I have talked about this, like where I think there's this expectation that projections are a magic wand.
And it goes like the opposite way too. I remember we did a show together a couple of years ago. It was a basketball show, and I mentioned that I had Giannis projected for like 70 points, and he actually scored 70, and everyone was like losing their minds. It was like, yeah, it's cool when that happens, but it doesn't actually mean anything. It's just like getting the actual point projection isn't something that you're really going to accomplish very often. It's more about understanding the range of outcomes that come with it.
Yeah. So what are you aiming for, Alex? If it's not a magic wand, then we're not trying to hit it right on the head.
Well, here's the funny thing about projections is that if you're going to win a tournament, you need to be really wrong about your projections, because it's like
that's a good point. Yeah,
you need your guys to score like 150 points more than you project them for. So, I mean, like that's really the key factor, is that you need to get lucky. And if you have the same guys as everyone else, then you're going to need a higher score to win because you're going to be competing against so many people that have those guys that go off too. And that's where getting a little bit contrarian and going to a lower projected player, it can be good, is like you don't necessarily need to score as many points to win if the slate bounces the right way.
So if you're breaking it down in layman's terms, what are projections?
The projection is just like the average outcome. So it's like on average, my lineup, if I have projected for 150, will score 150 points. But there's a lot of variance in that. So it's like on average, maybe it's score between 120 and 180. But if you have outlier performance by your guys, I mean, that will give you that upside.
All right. So Alex, let's move forward here and take ownership and put that in conjunction with player projections, because in this day and age, like you said, it back in the day, 4 or 5 years ago, you could just have good projections and play the top ranked guys or the top projected players and usually have a pretty decent success. That's not the case anymore. And that's one of the reasons why I know you specifically pride yourself on having good ownership projections. People have them. People have player projections. A lot of times they don't know how to marry the two of them and use them together in order to create better lineups.
Yeah, I think there's some pitfalls in trying to apply ownership projections in baseball. And the biggest one is that suppose I have Gio Urshela at 15% ownership and I have DJ LeMahieu at 13% ownership. It's like, since those guys are on the same team and everyone's stacking, like that combination of players is going to be much higher owned than if you just consider each individual player's ownership. So it's like, not only is there like, there's like a big correlation between certain players, and that can come even in other situations where if you have a certain like set of players, it can funnel you into certain lineup constructions where you really need to go heavy on the cheap value. So it's really intriguing, and it's like it's something that it takes some thinking to really come up with the best strategies on a given day, and that's why DFS is so interesting. But the way I would recommend approaching it to simplify it is you take your first stack. If you have a second stack, you take your second stack, and like those are ownerships 1 and 2, and then you have the pitcher ownership, and those 3 numbers will probably give you a good idea of how chalky your lineup is.
And Adam, I think this is one area where a lot of people have blind spots, and maybe you can do a good job of explaining how you approach something like this. Now, you'll see a lot of people, they're using ownership projections, and their whole mindset is built around high owned, fade, low owned, play. And I know all of us really have always been pretty big advocates of, like, you don't need an entire lineup filled with 2%ers, right? You can get some of these leverage plays or just low owned players with high ceilings, which means you don't have to fade Giannis at 40% against the Washington Wizards.
Yeah, and obviously in baseball, you can go a little bit more off the board just because of the amount of variance, but it's the same thing. Like, you're just trying to give yourself a path to win tournaments that doesn't involve having basically the same lineup as 3,000 other people and then hoping you come in first. You're trying to make it as easy a path as you can. One thing that I've started doing recently, and it kind of is like a progression of stuff I used to do, and I've gotten to this point now, but when I'm evaluating my lineups in terms of projection and ownership, one thing that you have to be careful of, I think, is there will be a tendency to overvalue low-owned plays that don't really have a ceiling or that aren't very good just because they're really low-owned. Like, if one player is 2% owned and has a very low ceiling and another player is 7% owned with a much higher ceiling, a lot of times you should prefer that 7% owned guy, but depending on how you're choosing your lineups, you might prefer the 2% guy. So one thing that I've been doing that I think has worked pretty well is, instead of just looking at the raw ownership, I'm taking it and comparing it to the ceiling or the boom probability or whatever you want to call it for different players or different stacks, so that I'm giving myself, or I'm playing lineups that have the best low owned, high upside plays as opposed to just low owned plays.
And sometimes somebody might be 2% for a reason, and others, most of the time, really, and other players are 40% for a reason. But I do think we have to draw a distinction, Alex, and this is where we get into the baseball specific stuff, between ownership in a sport like baseball and then ownership in a sport like basketball, where there are some positions in basketball where, take a situation where, let's say like a top point guard, we'll say Ben Simmons, Damian Lillard goes out. I'm wired to just go straight to the Sixers. where Damian Lillard goes out, CJ McCollum is 5,900, and what Terry Stotts is going to do with it. Like 5,900 or even 6,500 CJ McCollum, I kind of don't care about the ownership. Does that mean you play him everywhere? Maybe not. But maybe you just go over the field on a play that is so good like that. But with baseball, this is where it gets interesting, because Alex, you've got a guy, even take a Mike Trout, could be projected at like 40% ownership in a good spot. But his opportunities, if you're projecting him for round 4 plate appearances, is no more than any other hitter on this slate batting, in the 1 through 4 hole.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Trout, he's a great example, because on any given day he could go out there and get a 0 or a 2 or 3 or whatever, and that happens a decent amount of the time. And
those good players walk a lot too, which you can't control for that.
For sure, yeah. And they only get 4 chances to score, where on NBA it's like they're going up and down the floor 75 times. So there's a ton of variance in hitters, but another interesting wrinkle is pitchers can be a lot more consistent. I mean, there's a lot of variance in pitchers too, but the fact that they're going out there and throwing 100 pitches while and facing 25 batters, while each batter is only going up to the plate 4 times, that makes pitching a much more reliable option than hitters. And that's an interesting dynamic, because if you go for the high probability pitchers that are expensive, that really limits what you can do with your stacks. So you're trying to balance that factor too, where it's like you go with the safe pitcher and the low upside stack, or like the risky pitcher and the high upside stack. That's why it's so fun to play.
Adam, how do you approach ownership from a baseball perspective? Like, you and I have talked ownership for basketball for endless amounts of conversations about this. Same with baseball too. But how do you view it differently than basketball, outside of the obvious answers that we just hit on?
So I think that another reason, like I was talking before about comparing ownership to likelihood of success rather than just looking at ownership in a vacuum, I think that it shows the differences between the sports as well. Like in basketball, a lot of the times you're going to have players that have, a 65% chance of succeeding at their salary, and you're never going to really have that for hitters in baseball. Like if you take a 300 hitter, you used Mike Trout as an example, but if you take a 300 hitter and give him 4 at-bats in, an average situation, 25% of the time he's getting you 0 points. And then that's not even accounting for the times where he just walks or picks up a single or whatever. Like in baseball, they're going to fail so much more. So while in basketball, a lot of times you're going to have a player that's 60% owned and it's perfectly fine because he has an even higher chance of success than that. In baseball, when you get hitters that are starting on a normal slate that are starting to approach 30, 35% ownership, it starts to get to a point where you can pretty comfortably roster some other guys that are lower owned and come out ahead long term. It's not going to feel very good when you don't have what looks like the best hitting play on the slate, but there's just so much variance there. And so I think that's why, or another reason why it's important to look at ownership in conjunction with the range of outcomes, because it'll tell you that, while in a vacuum, Mike Trout being 25% owned might not be really that bad, when you compare him to all the other good outfielders on the slate and see that, he has a 15% chance of success and they're all at like 11%, but they're like 1/5 the ownership, you see that it's profitable to be playing these other guys.
And baseball is also unique in that you take somebody like Mike Trout, home runs are one thing, but oftentimes these players rely on their teammates being on base and being able to drive in runs or being able to drive them in. In basketball, a LeBron James type relies on nobody but himself. Sure, you could make the argument that he relies on his players to knock down shots on assist opportunities. but baseball is kind of dependent on other players at times as well. And Alex, I think that's why we start getting into the stack aspect of all of this. So we got projections, we talk ownership, and then you get into stacking. We'll start on here, and then we can touch on the top stack tool. So when it comes to stacking, I know a lot of people, most people now know that it's the plus EV way of doing things. What about that in terms of ownership? How are you looking at stacks and applying projections and ownership into the stacks to figure out what a good stack might be? Because we've done a lot of shows together, and you'll have people go, "Oh, I didn't think about that team. I wonder why Alex is on, the Tampa Bay Rays today when nobody's touching them." How does your decision-making process work when it comes to isolating stacks that might not be nearly as popular or even projected for as many points?
So I think people are too price sensitive when it comes to stacks, and when the pricing of a stack is lower than it should be, then like a ton of ownership gravitates to it. And if a stack is higher priced than it should be, it's going to be very low owned, because the guys you can fit around it are going to be pretty bad. But like there's so much variance in how a stack performs that just having that overpriced stack or paying up to be contrarian is one of my favorite plays in MLB, because like more than half the field probably is using an optimizer to build their lineups. And I mean, I do too on Fantasy Cruncher, but it's important to still get access to some lineups that have stacks that might not be optimal, but are really good. So the least favorite stack I have is the one that's really cheap and really mediocre, because it's going to be high owned, and then they're going to go up and put up average performance. And what does that really get you?
Yeah, and I think, Adam, the top stack tool, we had actually been at Awesemo for a while, and I think both of us discovered it like after we were here for a little while, and like, oh wow, this is.
It was like right around the same time too. We both messaged each other like, "Have you checked this out? Because it's actually it's really useful."
Yeah, and then started using it on the shows because it's really valuable. But simply enough, and then Alex, since it's your tool, we'll talk to you too. How do you somebody that didn't develop the tool, right? How do you use it day in and day out when we're looking at making quality baseball lineups, whether you're MMEing or even if you're doing a 3-max, which I think could be an interesting conversation too?
One thing I really like to use it for, and it goes back to what Alex was just saying about when you're using an optimizer, it's going to, unless you do some other things to give yourself access to those overpriced stacks, it's going to kind of force you onto those cheaper stacks, give you the good pitching and move on. I like using the stacks tool to set, what I do is I set stack 1 exposure caps in Fantasy Cruncher based on a combination of the top stack probability for each team and a leverage metric, of what their top stack probability is compared to their combined ownership. So what it does is it'll lower, whereas if I were to just run, 500 lineups in Fantasy Cruncher, it's going to give me a lot of those middling stacks that I don't really want and that are really popular. Whereas when I set the caps that way, it tends to lower the exposure I get to them and then force up exposure on some of those high upside, lower owned teams that are harder to get to. So what that does is it'll give me a bunch of lineups to choose from that have stacks pretty much all across the pricing spectrum and all across different roster constructions. And then I can go through and choose from those lineups which ones I think are the best combination of ownership and projection. But using the stack tool to do that kind of gives me a way to make Fantasy Cruncher do what I want it to do.
You get 50% off Awesemo Plus baseball package, monthly baseball package, by using the promo code Manfred. Yes, Rob, but not his first name. His last name, Manfred, MANFRED. 50% off the monthly Awesemo Plus MLB package right now. You got that till July 24th. So until, basically until opening day. And we got another one, Restart. You want to get 50% off an Awesemo Plus monthly pass. We're giving you that back. It's $45 for a month. That's 50% off the top. Restart. And then it's $25 for 31 days of MLB Awesemo Plus. So the projections, ownership, everything, all of our articles, the lineup builder, you name it. So Manfred for 50% off Awesemo Plus. That expires on the 24th. and then restart for 50% off everything at Awesemo. I would say that's the way to go. You go for the $45. You got that till August 3rd, and you've got a whole lot of sports overlapping here. So you're hitting everything under that umbrella, because if they have contests, we've got content. You know it. Over at Awesemo.com. Go to Awesemo.com/join. Use those promos at checkout. Manfred for baseball, 50% off, and Restart for everything, 50% off. Alex, when you were creating this tool, did you feel like there was some type of void in the process as far as baseball went, and this was one way to kind of fill that gap?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, the thing is that if you just use projections and ownership, as Adam was saying, it doesn't necessarily capture the upside, especially because in baseball, you got to separate the pitchers and the hitters because they're like two different animals. So the top stacks tool helps you take it a step beyond the projection. And one way I've implemented it is that if you some of you guys might use Excel, but others, just using Fancy Cruncher or hand building. But one metric that I like to include is I have the projection, the ownership, and then I have my top stack percentage for both stacks. And that's like another way that I work in the upside, because that can definitely be lost. And also, we're going to have that for pitchers too. So it's going to be like the chance that each pitcher will be the highest scoring.
Oh, wow. Okay. So by the way, when you say top stack chance, we're talking about the probability that will be the highest scoring stack on the slate. But that doesn't always mean that they should be the one that you're rostering at the highest clip either, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that like my approach originally in baseball was, this is before Awesemo.com, is I just like made a bunch of lineups and I had a little bit of each team. But then what I realized is I was getting like way too much of certain teams and way too little others. So that's something the top stack by the metric is going to tell you, the chalkiest team is going to be like the best one. And obviously, you got to take it further than that and put all the pieces of the puzzle together to come up with a strategy that will make your lineup different than everyone else's, but still have a great chance of winning.
Adam, even if you don't have access to a tool like this, you can still figure something out on your, and not nearly as easy, but like, how do you go about saying, all right, well, this team has a 20% chance of being the top stack, but they're also going to be owned they're also going to have 30% ownership share, whereas another team might have a 13% top stack probability, but their ownership is coming in around 9%.
Right. So when I make my lineups in Cruncher, I'm going to put I'm going to basically, the team that has a 13% chance of success and is only projected for 9% ownership is going to grade out better for me than the team that is relatively overowned, even though they have the higher chance of success. So when I make my lineups in Cruncher, I'm still going to get stacks of that team that is a little bit overowned. But if I wasn't using the top stack tool, I would probably be getting even more of that team and less of the team that's 13%. Has a 13% chance of success with 9% ownership. So using the top stack tool and grading them out based on that, I can get more of those teams that I'm looking for that are a little bit underowned. And then it kind of all goes back together where you're grading out your lineups, like Alex said, based on ownership, projection, top stack percentage. You want to at least have built lineups that are different from each other in terms of roster construction and what teams you're stacking and all of that. So I think that the top stack tool helps you do that. And then it also helps you grade those lineups to decide which ones give you the best chance of success in whatever tournament you're playing.
And I know this is slate specific. There's no question here, but we always get the question, how many teams should I be stacking on each slate, right? And Adam, if you have say a 9-game slate, you've got 18 teams going. Again, it's slate specific. I understand that. And you kind of just broke down your process there. But if someone were to ask you the very specific question, how many teams should I be stacking, Alex, each day? What would your answer be?
Yeah, for me,
sorry. You know what? Whoever wants to go. Go ahead, Adam, and then Alex.
Okay. Yeah. So for me, I mean, it's like you said, it's obviously slate dependent, and I don't go into it with one specific answer. It's determined really heavily by how the ownership for different stacks is broken down. There will be, a handful of slates where I think that, and normally it'll be a situation where I like a cheap pitcher more than most people do, and there's an expensive stack that nobody can get to except for me because I have a cheap pitcher I like. So I'll end up just playing a ton of that stack, kind of paired with a bunch of different teams, a bunch of different versions of that stack. More often than not, if I'm playing 150 lineups, especially, I'm going to diversify a bit more than that. But it's still not going to be stacking every team, and it's not normally going to be stacking one or two teams. But a lot of it just comes down to exactly how many teams in the top stack tool are projected to be underowned. Is there one team that is drastically overowned, in which case I can kind of just completely avoid them and move all that ownership to a bunch of other teams? Or is the highest owned team still a team that I think is a good play? So I want to get to them, and that takes some ownership away from what I can do with contrarian stacks. So, on average, I would probably say, just guessing, I would end up somewhere around a quarter of the field stacked. But it does vary pretty drastically based on how the ownership percentages look for individual stacks.
Okay, yeah, and you, Alex, someone asked you the same question. How many teams do I stack?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can probably make good lineups with every team stacked out there, but this isn't something I really aim to do, diversification. I just kind of figure out which lineups I like the best and go with them. But most nights I'll have, on like a full slate, I'll have about 2/3 of the team stacked, and then significant ownership to probably the top 50%, I'd say. So I really mix it up. And I want to give some numbers here about tomorrow's slate, if you guys want to talk about, or Thursday's slate, because we already have the top stacks up for that.
Yeah, please.
So right now, the top stack percentage of the Yankees is 28.8%, and their ownership is 22%. So the reason why is because they're going up against Max Scherzer, and Scherzer is going to be the highest owned player of the day according to our ownership projections. So obviously people aren't going to have many lineups with both Scherzer and the Yankees. So that's creating a situation where the Yankees are going pretty underowned. So that would be a prime stack I'd focus on in this particular situation.
So I was thinking too, Adam, another question that's pretty common, and we haven't had baseball in almost 10 months now, so it's been a while. It's easy to forget things. And there is no specific answer to this, but you might be able to push people in the right direction. You'll hear how much of a team is too much, right? So there's a low-owned team, and you like them, right? So they're not going to be popular. They grade out pretty well in the top stack tool. But for one reason or another, they're not going to be popular, whether they face a pitcher that people think is good, or they're too expensive, or just a bunch of other teams out there are in better spots. What is the answer to, how much of a team is too much when they're, particularly low owned?
I approach it, I think, the same way Alex said, where basically I just rank my teams and I go with what I get. Like, I don't go through and say, I already have 10 Pirate stacks, I don't want any more of that, because I have enough things put in place in my process where I'm already ranking my lineups based on median projection, based on ownership, based on upside. If when I do all of that, the lineups coming to the top, if it's just saying go with a ton of Pittsburgh, I will. But normally that's not going to be the case, because normally there's just going to be so many different teams that are stacked in really good lineups that it's mixing and matching them. But I trust the numbers that I use. I trust the process I put in place. So if all of that stuff tells me that I should have X amount of a stack, I'm fine with just going with that. And if I'm wrong, then I go on to the next slate.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense to me. I think, Alex, some people don't have the ranking systems in place, so they're just, like you said, only using Fantasy Cruncher. So they have to, I think they might be forced to tinker with things a little bit more, because if you're not familiar with, how to use Fantasy Cruncher, I don't want to say properly, but I guess massage it to some extent, you might hit crunch on 300 lineups, and like 200 of them are the same team, and then you're manually adjusting ownership to try and push it down. So I think it might be more geared towards somebody that is using just the fantasy cruncher option with our projections and with ownership, something like that.
Yeah. This is obviously an extensive topic, and we actually did a series on Fantasy Cruncher for baseball, so make sure to check that out on Awesemo.com. But there's some different videos talking about how to set all the different settings to get the lineups that you want. Because at the end of the day, you don't want Fantasy Cruncher to tell you who to pick. You want to tell Fantasy Cruncher who you want to pick, and then figure out how to set it up to give you lineups that you like based on your analysis. And it has the right level of customization to make it possible to do that.
All right, so we've got projections, we've hit on ownership, we've hit on the top stack tool, haven't hit on SuperDraft. It's back, baby. SuperDraft. It's been a while since we said that one. If you haven't played there yet, there's no reason not to head over to SuperDraft right now. There's no salaries at all. No salaries. It's all multipliers, which is a really, really cool system there. So the best players are only getting a 1x multiplier. Whatever they score is what they get. Whereas other players, you would be referring to them as value players on a site like DraftKings or FanDuel. Well, they would have maybe a 1.5, 1.7 multiplier. So it's a pretty unique and, dare I say, revolutionized way of doing things. If you haven't done it yet, if you're new to Awesemo, if you found us somehow over the break or through MMA or League of Legends or NASCAR or PGA, or you have been with us and haven't checked it out yet, if you use the promo code AWESEMO10, AWESEMO 10, all one word, plus the 1 and the 0 attached, you get $10 free on your first deposit at $10 or more, and $20 total free on your first deposit of $100 or more. So $10 on $10 or more, $20 on $100 or more. You can download the app or play at superdraft.io. Again, completely different than anything you've played, multiplier mode, but you can still use projections, and we will, of course, have those projections at awesemo.com. All right, fellas, so we went over, and hit that thumbs up if you haven't done so yet. It helps us greatly. We went over projections, we went over ownership, we went over how to stack, how to use the top stack tools. I think all that's left now is to move on to tomorrow, where we'll actually get into a little bit of fantasy cruncher action. Now, Alex, I know you mentioned that we did a whole series on that, but I think having 3 people maybe bounce some ideas off of each other and go over the process one day before we actually get into the start of the season and actually be able to take an upcoming slate for Thursday will be pretty helpful stuff.
Yeah, definitely. That'll be good to go over all the tools in real examples so that we can kind of show people how it's done.
Adam, we'll leave people with this, right? What would you say for somebody jumping into this? They want to advance their game. They want to use projections and ownership and tools. What would you say? And I'm putting you on the spot here. This isn't something we play. What would you say the biggest mistake or mistakes to avoid are when beginning to use more advanced tools and a more advanced way of building lineups? You can think back from your own personal history that you corrected too.
I'll say I think what I probably struggled with the most when I kind of went from like hand building lineups to using Fantasy Cruncher more is what Alex was mentioning in getting it to do what you want it to do. Like its job is to optimize what you're putting into it, but you don't want it to just be spitting out the best median projections and not giving you anything that has any sort of upside or anything like that. So it's definitely something where I would recommend watching the video that I think it was Josh made on how to use it for MLB, how to use Fantasy Cruncher for MLB, because there's just so many different settings where it'll make life easier for you if you understand how to use it, and you'll start getting it to give you lineups that are more in line with what you're looking for to win a tournament.
Alex, I just wrote an article for Best Ball for our seasonal product that was essentially the five biggest mistakes to avoid in best ball drafts. And to someone that's been doing them for a while, it's very simple stuff. For anyone that's relatively new to best ball, these are things that they might not have thought about yet. So I think when you or Adam give someone an idea of what type of mistakes there are to avoid, to you, it might be common sense. It might be a mistake that you made years ago and you have since corrected, but other people are still struggling with. So what do you have?
I think that the thing that gets lost in the process sometimes is that you have to create a lineup that is creative. You can't be doing what other people are doing, and that's why like you have to pair all these tools with your own strategies and intuitions. Like, for example, coming up with roster constructions that might be hard to make on a certain day. Like, I know a lot of people, they'll set their stacking scheme to 5-3 DraftKings because that's kind of the best stack. But there might be days where you can't fit two really good teams together because the salaries just don't work out, or maybe they don't work out with the good pitching. So that's the situation where maybe you relax the restrictions a little bit and you can find some really interesting combinations that will give you a huge edge. And being able to have the flexibility and thought to come up with these lineups that are really interesting and unique and valuable, that's going to help you take your game from being just a good player to a great one.
I think that's pretty huge. And to build off of that, wouldn't you say that there's a mental block oftentimes of wanting to play the guys that you believe are in the best position to succeed, even if that doesn't mean making the best actual lineup from a mathematical or a probability standpoint, in terms of, well, I got to play Trout. I got to play Trout today. I have to play Stanton. He's got a phenomenal matchup against a weak lefty that doesn't throw breaking balls. And then you get stuck in this mindset of, like, these guys need to be in my lineup no matter what. But essentially everybody else is thinking the same exact thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you're trying to put in the best plays, you're going to be funneled into like the same kind of lineups as everyone else. So it's like you got to make some plays with those guys like Stanton and Trout that are really good players, because on any given day they can go off for 50 points. But like you kind of mix it up and have a couple of those plays or stacks that might be a little bit less probability to succeed, but just to give your lineup a unique twist. You
should build something that shows the hit rate on chalk at a certain percent and then at a certain level of ownership. I'd be very curious to see what it is. You know what I mean? Like 30+% owned guys throughout the season. How often did they hit? And then you'd obviously set something for what that would be regarded as. But I don't know. What do you think it is? Do you think chalk? Would you say that chalk in baseball doesn't hit enough to the point where I guess that would be the obvious answer, right? Like chalk in baseball doesn't hit enough to the point where you need to be rostering super high owned players consistently every night.
Yeah, I think that the ownership of individual players is important, but you got to look at your lineup construction as a whole. So, for example, Thursday, Johnny Cueto is the obvious pitcher to target because Cole, Scherzer, and Kershaw are the other ones. So it's like everyone's going to be picking the Dodgers bats, and they're the most likely to succeed. And to make that lineup work, you need to like have some sort of lineup construction that nobody else has, where you're taking kind of the chalk stack and having something different that gives you a uniqueness that helps it. So you don't need all like 10 players to go off to win the slate.
And Adam, sometimes people are just so unwilling to play somebody that in their opinion is, well, not even in their opinion, but might be an objectively bad player. But there are nights where that objectively bad player is actually worth playing. And that's a tough thing to wrap your head around.
Yeah, for sure. And it goes back, I thought about it when you were talking to Alex, but you had asked me earlier about if I still use projections and stuff when I'm playing single entry or 3-max. And that's one reason why I do. It's really hard, no matter how long you've been playing DFS for, it's really hard if you're going to sit there by hand and try and make a lineup to actually get yourself to say, oh, I'm not going to play Mike Trout. I'm going to play, whoever is clearly not as good as Mike Trout. Whereas when you're using projections and using all of these numbers and data points, your decisions are kind of made for you, and it takes that bias out of it, and you're going to end up just getting better lineups over the long run by doing that.
So let's do this over the final couple of minutes here. If you guys have any questions in chat, as far as anything we've talked about today, like I said, yesterday's stuff, we got into all of the player situations, the team scenarios, the implications and effects from the 60-game season. Tomorrow, we're going to get into more fantasy cruncher stuff. But if there's anything you've been watching today, you heard it, you have questions about it, maybe it still wasn't, maybe it still isn't as clear to you as you'd like it to be, let us know. We can take the next couple of minutes to do that. Jamal asks, Alex, is there a threshold of total lineup ownership percentage that you look to stay under?
So the way I would kind of do it is I'd build some lineups using Fantasy Cruncher and see, like, if I build the optimal lineup, what is the ownership percentage? Because that's a baseline for like what the chalk is on a given day. It's going to vary a lot based on how many games there are. So that's kind of your frame of reference. And in baseball, probably staying around the 50% mark for that highest owned lineup could be a good target number. But going higher or lower isn't necessarily something I would avoid.
Do you have a take on that, Adam?
Yeah, I personally don't set anything because, again, I just have so much other stuff in place to end up deciding what lineups I want to play, where the highest owned lineups that I make just aren't going to, I'm not going to choose them. And I make so many extra lineups that I don't need, that I don't restrict the lineups that I'm making. But by the time I've sorted everything down and chosen my lineups, it's going to end up being a good combination of low ownership and high projection.
Joshua says, why whenever I change my pitcher's ownership percentage, does it say it can only make one lineup? There's something wrong in your settings that you're doing. Yeah, I'd have to look at what?
One of those problems could be like a lot of optimizers, they don't allow hitters versus your pitcher. So if you have that setting, it could make it impossible.
Especially on a 2-game slate. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That probably is what it is, now that you think about it, yeah. I don't know, you have to look, but I don't know. You could always just set everything back to default and then change the pitchers to – actually, how many batters will you guys allow against the pitcher on a 2-game slate?
Well, I think on DraftKings, because you have 2 pitchers, you have to allow some, because otherwise you're basically saying – you're going to stack the 2 teams that aren't going up against your pitchers on FanDuel.
And I would think too, with like 3 pitchers going that are all really good, you're going to get some very low scoring games. So you might need that solo shot in a game against the pitcher that you have in order to have any shot of winning.
For sure. Yeah. There's definitely a good likelihood that you're going to need batters for more than 2 of the games. And also that gives you the lineup flexibility too.
Adam, here's one from Jamal. He says, when you incorporate upside in your process, is that ceiling projections or something different?
For me, I use the top stack tool to look at the upside of a stack. In basketball, it's a little bit easier because you can work with the data a little bit more and project for each individual player how often, a lot more accurately, how often they're going to exceed a certain point threshold. So I'll do it for each individual player. In baseball, I do it more just based on the entire stack.
All right. Yeah. And if you guys are subs, check out the premium Slack chat too. There's a lot of people always willing to answer questions in there. Some of them might be other subs that can still be helpful. Now, always be sure who you're listening to. You know what I mean? You don't want to get yourself into any trouble listening to, some of these rascals. No, but most people are actually looking to help. And, you can always hit us up in chat as well. All right. Last one here, and then we'll head out for the afternoon. Steven asks, are you doing anything different, Alex, with this kind of short spring training in terms of weighing pitching or hitting having an advantage? That's an interesting question.
So the biggest factor for me is that these games are starting in July, where normally baseball kicks off in April. And I remember the Cubs home opener got snowed out like a couple of years ago when I was trying to go. So like the temperatures are going to be really high. It's going to be batting weather right from the get-go, where normally the pitchers are going to start off with a pretty good advantage. So I think that I think it's going to be batter's advantage for sure, like for most of the season.
Adam, are you doing anything, or are you just letting it ride?
I mean, I agree with what Alex said, and I think that it's another example of using Vegas lines being an efficient way. If hypothetically all the Vegas lines were 2 runs lower than you would expect, it's probably a pretty good bet that pitchers are going to do better coming out of the gate. That's obviously not the case, but I think stuff like that, the best indicator is normally Vegas lines. I think one thing that'll be interesting to pay attention to is, with it being a shorter season, the games obviously matter more than they ever have before individually. So I think that you'll see a higher percentage of innings pitched by really good pitchers, whether it's the best starters on the team getting more starts or going deeper in the games, or the best relievers getting a higher percentage of innings, because you can't really just throw away games like you can in a 162 game season. So I think maybe that's something that keeps hitting in check a little bit, but the weather definitely favors hitting this time of year. And so I would still expect them to have the advantage.
All right. Well, that'll do it for us. Great stuff, fellas. Alex Baker, Adam Scherer, breaking everything down that we possibly can as far as this stuff goes. I know it can be at times a dry topic, but winning money doesn't come easy, and it's not all exciting. So stuff like this is going to get you where you need to go for sure. And we want to give out some, free content as well to help you understand what the process looks like and how to get there. So thanks to all you guys for hanging out, sticking around. If you've been with us for a while, see a bunch of those names in chat. We appreciate you, and everybody new, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because we're going to have a ton of content coming down the pike, and hit that thumbs up before you leave. We'll see you back here tomorrow on the final MLB primer. Awesemo.com.